So we're back with chapter 8. And the next part we'll talk about is what role does the government play in this whole idea of uneven development? Well, first of all, the government is the one that makes the rules for how things are done, right? And the markets that are happen. So, right, they set the rules, and that's a big thing. So let's talk about the government. First of all, the government or the state is not just one thing, it's many things. There's different parts. So, for instance, the Department of Defense, the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Education, these are federal agencies that all have differing goals and differing actions in the economy. Sometimes they are working together, sometimes they are not. But what the Department of Defense does, right, by buying military goods, by paying people's wages who are soldiers or for hospitalization, that's a big part of the economic activity. The Department of the Treasury, the rules about how much money you can loan or all these kind of things. So those are all different parts of it, okay? But these all are important because the context in which economic activity happens. The rules and laws are set by the state. The tax laws, there's always this kind of argument how we should tax business or industry, right? Banking regulations. How much money does a bank need to have on hand to give you a loan? Labor laws, right? How much money, minimum wage, equal rights access, okay? And the state has many roles. It is an employer. One of the largest employers in many areas is either the state or federal local government. So think about, how many people actually work for the city of Chicago, and that's a decent amount. In some smaller areas, some very rural areas of the country where there's not much industry, there's only farming, many more people actually as a percentage work in government because you still have to have people who are working, as policemen, firemen, who are working at the local village hall. Government is also an investor. So think about the Department of Defense, right? We buy lots of airplanes, very, very expensive airplanes. And that investment drives the aeronautical industry in the United States. It is one of the main sources of income, which allows them to also be one of the leading, we are one of the leaders in that kind of technology in the world. The government signs contracts to buy computers from a certain company or not. And then policymaker, right? The government sets policies. If they want to make it easier for people to borrow money, they can change those laws or they can make it harder. Okay? So when we look at what a state or a country does in its own economy, let's look at how that interacts in the world economy. Every state does this. And the way states do this, it ranges. Some states are very loosely regulated. They don't do much to control their industry. They kind of let it left to the people. And some states are extremely closed. In countries like North Korea and China, everything that is done economically has to be approved by the state. So it is basically the state, and the economy is governed by the state. So a very, very closed economy to a loose one, and there's kind of that range. Governments follow many things. Countries that want to move from the periphery to the core, that want to become more developed, they can do two things. They can try to gear their economy to be import substitution, which just means this. Instead of buying phones from the United States or buying American cars, they're going to try to build up their own industry so that they only buy cars made in their country. China did this very well. They started working on making phones of their own so people would buy Chinese phones and Chinese cars. Or the other way you do it is you basically find out what can I sell, what can I make well, and you do it around that. So countries that have a lot of mineral wealth, like oil, will do this because that is their main source of income. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, right? It's centered around that. You also have this debate between what we call protectionism and free trade. So what are the laws about trade and commerce between countries? Is it hard to do? Is it easy? Free trade would say there's no laws. That basically whatever you sell, and as little regulation as possible. And the idea is that this encourages more trade. If you make trade easier, then more trade will happen. Protectionism is more like, kind of helps, in a sense, support your own local industries. So for instance, we have some rules about selling goods in other countries. If they sell cars that are made in other countries like Japan or Germany, they have to pay a little bit more taxes. than American cars, and that's to protect American automakers. And so this goes back and forth, and the argument is that free trade works better because it increases income. But what we have found is that free trade also leads to that income disparity. In other words, it may increase overall trade, but the profits go to the wealthiest. Okay? So let's talk about these development states. These are the states that want to move from the periphery to the core, right? And a few have done that. The states that did the export strategy, exporting oil or coal or whatever they have, or exporting cheaply made phones, whatever they're exporting, the problem with that is if something happens to the cost of oil or gold or cheaply made phones, then you're kind of stuck. So a lot of countries in Central America, one of their biggest exports was coffee. But in the 1980s, the price of coffee dropped. And a lot of these countries all of a sudden had less money because they weren't really selling as much coffee for as much money. Right? China has been a little bit different. China started off as an export theme. They were making things made in China. They would make the clothing, the shirts, the shoes that the rest of the world wanted. Right? But that money that they used, they plowed right back into infrastructure and education. They built more schools, they hired more teachers, and they built more highways and hospitals and bridges and airports. And the reason they did this was the money they made from exports went back into their own economy. So if they're building highways, then that means that they're paying local construction firms and workers. If they're building more schools, that money goes towards people who are working as teachers. And the product, a better educated workforce, allows them to move towards a different model. And instead of making the parts for the phones, now making their own phones. So moving away from exports and moving away towards a more high-tech society. It's an interesting thing because in China, they are very much a closed system. The government decides what the economy is going to do, and they can make these choices much more easily than the United States can. The federal government really can't tell Ford or GM what to do with their cars too much, but China could in their country. So in other words, this argument is that to make this move from the periphery to the core, it works better in states where there's a little bit less freedom, actually. In other words, what we find is equitable wealth, where the wealth is easily spread. In other words, the richest and the poorest person are not that far apart, doesn't really correlate with democracy. Interesting thought. We're going to leave you here because it's time for my lunch, and I need you all to get up and stretch and shake out the sillies. And then we're going to come back with our next part.